Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to join the previous moderators and speakers in thanking the folks from the Duke Law Journal, the organizers, thanking Professor Marks, as well as all the panelists who are here. We have an interesting panel teed up with three interesting panelists. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist was called away by an urgent matter and isn't able to join us. But we have still a wealth of panelists and opinions. So let's get right to it. First, let me introduce Professor Ryan Calo from the University of Washington, and we'll ask him to speak about his the Symposium article that you can see on the program, or whatever else he would like us to hear about. Ryan.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you so much. And so thanks to Mason and to the Duke Law Journal for organizing this. I've had an absolutely terrific editing process with the journal, and I just have really appreciated your care, and you've improved the piece a lot. So thank you very much. So this project grows out of my last paper with Danielle Keats-Citrin at UVA, in which we developed a threat to the legitimacy of the administrative state due to a trend toward throwing away the expertise and discretion that legitimizes the administrative state in the first place, by recommitting that expertise and discretion to machines. And while that was a relatively pessimistic piece, we, in a nod to what IFOMA calls techno-realism, we didn't want to deny the government these powerful new tools. And so one of the things we thought about was what are the ways in which government can use contemporary affordances to improve governance, and that's where this paper came out of. So it's not hard to see that that the government lags behind other sectors when it comes to technology. Like, I mean, I can pay for a cup of coffee with my face, but if I go to the DMV, I have to bring a cashier's check, right? I mean, it's just, and so I want to take seriously the question that John McGinnis poses in his book from 2013, Accelerating Democracy, where he asks, how long should a society tolerate a government that refuses to take advantage of contemporary affordances? And one such affordance that is used by all manner of different sectors and all manner of different activities is modeling. But by which I mean roughly, of course I defined it in the paper, but roughly sort of replicating physical or other phenomena with data. Now, the government does use modeling, of course. I learned a lot from Cary's work and from David's work. They really took the time to look and see what governments are really doing, what federal governments are really doing with AI and machine learning. But the government does model. My favorite example of this is actually the weather. And I think it's a terrific example, that modeling the weather is a terrific example for a couple reasons. One of which is, weather modeling is objectively getting better year after year. It got a lot better in the 70s with the ascent of supercomputing, but it just gets better and better and better, objectively speaking. You can just tell it's better. And also, second, it's really consequential. Lots of people make decisions on the basis of government weather models, right? It helps with any manner of activities, aviation, military, farming, you name. And it's attractive to think that modeling of that kind could be used for a lot more, even for modeling people, so-called agent-based modeling, which Cary also has mentioned in his work. So Los Angeles uses these complex models to time traffic lights. Maybe urban planners could, maybe urban planners that grew up playing like SimCity, right, could model attacks on soda and what that would do, before implementing it. But I think you got to be careful, right? So Charles Lindblom wrote The Science of Muddling Through, which is the pun of modeling through, 60 years ago now. But his point remains a very forceful one, which is that policymakers do not have the information or resources to address problems at the root. They have to follow what he calls the branch method, where they intervene more or less blindly in a narrow way, and then they correct unintended consequences as they arise. We are very, very far from Plato's utopia of philosopher kings. But one place that I did think that modeling could make a difference, maybe even today, is in the places where law already requires or expects, say, federal agencies to do some kind of cost benefit or impact assessment. Those are being done right now in an incredibly back of the napkin basic way. I mean, I went looking for sort of rigorous descriptions of how should you figure out what the impact is on small businesses? How should you figure out the environmental impact? How does one do a cost benefit analysis for OIRA purposes or whatever it happens to be? And the things I found were so simplistic that they were things that were just sort of like, step one, what are the costs? You know what I mean? Step two, what are the, let's compare them. You know what I mean? It was really amazing. Whereas we have modeling, and indeed in the financial sector, that's somewhat done, where regulations are modeled to see what their impact could be on the economic system. But as we embrace modeling to the extent that we do, there's a couple kinds of dangers, at least a couple kinds of dangers that I think we need to think about. And the first set of dangers is pitfalls, concerns, right, is familiar to those of us who study algorithmic accountability and know the algorithmic accountability literature, to which many people on this in this panel, you know, Hannah and Cary and Ed have all contributed mightily to, and Mason too. You know, these are concerns like, you know, privacy. I mean, this requires a lot of data to do this modeling. Discrimination, automation bias, the brittleness of these systems that work for a time and then break down. And maybe there's mitigation strategies. You know, Ed has a great paper in Penn Law Review about mitigation strategies for some of these things. And maybe not, but the point is that they're understood, and we're as a community studying them. The other set of issues, though, is more familiar to critics, like long-standing critics of systems and cost-benefit analysis. People who have been critiquing systems analysis and then ultimately cost-benefit analysis, which is a pretty dominant model in a lot of sectors today. And you know, these amount to a critique that models are always an imperfect replica of the world. They're never really what's there. And they systematically include and exclude based on what is legible to the model, and based on the normative priors of the modeler. So SimCity, which I mentioned before, which, you know, people played SimCity, they went on to be urban planners. This is a great article about all these urban planners who were interviewed and talking about how much they love to play SimCity, that game where you can like build a city and see what happens with it. That game was designed by a person who had been reading Jay Forrester's controversial book, Urban Dynamics. And as such, the game embeds a worldview wherein economic activity is the primary indicia of human flourishing, and where government intervention tends to undermine progress. And these latter set of issues are all the more perilous for their invisibility. So really, in many ways, this article was trying to bring together two kinds of critique of modeling. I was taken to task on Twitter by somebody pointing out some other things I should have been reading, which were in Europe and another discipline. And I went and read those too, and the new draft includes that discussion too. And these are, you know, deep dives into some of the perils of modeling. And these are references from the last few years. And so there's a growing attention to this issue, and I think that's really great. I think ultimately, though, modeling kind of puts the availability, the existence of modeling, puts policymakers in a kind of a bind, where on the one hand, we ought to expect of them that they use these powerful affordances just like everybody else, every other sector is using. And on the other, they're running into some relatively inevitable pitfalls and concerns and trade-offs when they do so. So just to make room for everybody else, I'll stop there. And I just want to say thank you again. Thank you, Ed, for moderating, and I look forward to hearing everybody.
Thanks, Ryan. Let me pass the baton next to Professor Hannah Bloch-Wehba from the Texas A&M University School of Law for your comments.
Thanks. And thank you so much to Ed for moderating, Ryan and Cary. It's nice to be here virtually with you. And to the Duke Law Journal students who've been working so hard to organize this. Thanks, we really appreciate it. I want to pick up, I think, with one of the assumptions and sort of intuitions that Ryan's comments raised, which is that we expect and desire the administrative state to make use of the same technologies, affordances, tools that are available to us as consumers in other domains. And I think Ryan nicely sort of said, you know, I can pay for a coffee with my face, but I need to bring a cashier's check to the DMV. Now, just recently, the IRS suggested that it would move to using face recognition in order to sort of verify identity for taxpayers. And it prompted an enormous backlash, suggesting that maybe there are settings in which we actually don't think that the administrative state should be using the same affordances as are available to us in other domains. Maybe there are certain kinds of use cases that really prompt us to resist this sort of importation of technology from outside the state into it, right? And I think this is a particularly important issue because automated decision-making rests substantially, although not entirely, on technologies that are procured from the private sector. And while I think to some extent this is less true in the federal administrative state, certainly at the state and local level, where we have entities like municipal police departments or state welfare agencies looking to automation for efficiency and cost savings, we see pretty prevalent contracting out. And I think that these shifts to contract out to use the same sorts of high-tech tools as are available in other domains are particularly pronounced in the context of law enforcement, where a cottage industry of technologies and techniques, right, biometric surveillance, but also license plate readers, predictive policing, social media monitoring, are transforming law enforcement at the local, state, and federal levels and expanding its capacity. And for a growing number of people, this rise of sort of automated decision-making in law enforcement context does not reassure that the administrative state is going to be able to make better decisions in a more fair, equitable manner. I think instead it's raising a fundamental question of whether these tools ought to be substantially limited or even abolished, and particularly amid calls to democratize and transform policing and other law enforcement systems like immigration enforcement. I think the continued sort of privatization of law enforcement creates serious obstacles to democratic participation and control. And I want to use my time today to explore the rise of some movements against automated decision-making in law enforcement, and to consider some of the lessons that they might teach us about the limits of these tools in particularly high risk environments. So it's tempting to see these transformations as sort of bloodless interventions that promote accountability or efficiency, or that keep the government sort of up to date with the capacity outside of government itself. But I think a growing sort of popular mobilization, both social movements and also labor movements, really challenges this vision. And particularly with respect to administrative agencies that are directly responsible for state-sanctioned violence and for incarceration. And I think this offers us a sort of different vision of democracy and what democratic control over administrative agencies should look like, their use of technology included. So in my view, there are at least a couple of existing visions of algorithmic accountability, and the dominant one is sort of top-down and technocratic, and looks to technology itself to interrogate whether systems and tools can be made trustworthy, fair, and accountable. And I think this sort of rich interdisciplinary literature has identified a lot of these core drawbacks of algorithmic governance and sort of fairness, accountability, and transparency deficits, and rightly explores how we might engineer technical systems in a way that can be made sort of more consistent with law and policy and public values. The second vision, I think, is a little bit different. It's put forth, instead of looking at the content of automated decision-making as such, it's sort of advanced by social and labor movements who take issue with the use of these systems by the state in certain contexts, most notably, I think, law enforcement contexts. And these movements are really advocating for more direct control of these modes of governance. And so, to be sure, I think these movements are sharing many of the intuitions about fairness, accountability, and transparency deficits that have sort of been well trod in the literature. But rather than seeking top-down reform, I think that social and labor movements are really trying to govern automated decision-making from the bottom up. And by bottom up, I mean both that these movements aren't primarily focused on traditional legal institutions or courts. And I also mean that they are seeking more power for those who are at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. So consider, for example, immigration enforcement. Technology is woven throughout the immigration enforcement apparatus. President Trump's Muslim ban executive order called for continuous vetting of immigrants and visa applicants, developed what it called the Extreme Vetting Initiative, and called for contractors to develop this sort of technical vetting strategy to screen social media and other sort of intelligence about immigrants. Representatives from tech firms and defense contractors sort of fell all over themselves to demonstrate that they could do this impossible task. And it sort of symbolized how deeply our intuitions about the capacity of technology are woven into immigration enforcement. But it's not just about social media screening, right? Detentions and deportations also depend on an informational infrastructure that is made possible by partnerships with technology firms. Firms like Microsoft or Amazon, Palantir, and Anduril have entered into contracts with ICE for the purposes of providing a diverse array of services, including storage, data sharing, and so forth. And at one level, we might say the problem here is about the capacity of the technology itself. And certainly critics took issue with the technical sort of aspects of extreme vetting, right? Civil society organizations and technologists opposed extreme vetting on accuracy and objectivity grounds, said it couldn't really do what we want it to do. This is the traditional way of looking at the problems of algorithmic governance. but the most forceful critique here, I don't think, is about fairness or accuracy. I think the most forceful critique is actually about a sort of unaccountable immigration apparatus using technology to expand its discretion and its capacity in ways that are immune to democratic control, in spaces that are already sort of removed from democratic accountability. And so against this background, we've seen the emergence of a movement that brings together racial justice movements, social justice movements, immigrant rights advocacy, alongside workers. Workers at tech firms that contract with ICE, workers at tech firms that contract with other firms that contract with ICE, right? For example, in 2018, Amazon workers wrote a letter demanding that the firm should stop providing services to Palantir because of Palantir's work with ICE. And I think that increasingly, the mobilization of workers alongside these other movements to demand accountability from the bottom up, to demand that those who are primarily affected by these agencies should have a greater voice in how they are governed and how they use technology, pose a real challenge to some of our foundational assumptions about how technology might be improved, made more accurate, made more objective, made to work better in these spaces. I think at bottom, the sort of bottom-up critique does not want technology to work better for the government. Instead, I think what's most important in some of these spaces is for technology not to work for these purposes at all. And to understand the richness of this vision, I think it's important to contrast calls for sort of direct democratic accountability, mobilization, resistance to technology with the more technocratic interventions that have been sort of historically offered. So I think some of the safeguards that lawyers intuit will sort of solve the problems of unaccountable technology being used in agencies are very unlikely to satisfy movements who are seeking sort of democratic control and a redistribution of power to those who are more dramatically affected by these entities. So the final question I want to ask then is, how do our current legal protections and arrangements facilitate democratic accountability of these technologies? And as I suggested, from the top down, the perspective might be one thing. We can build all of the sort of procedural safeguards, fairness requirements, require auditing, impact assessments that we want. But I find it very implausible that from the bottom up, those interventions will be sufficient to sort of legitimate the use of technology in these spaces. It's not a particularly satisfying answer to the foundational challenge that I think is being posed here. And instead, I think to the extent these systems sort of intermingle private and public power in ways that that enable both agencies and vendors to sort of circumvent direct accountability, I think that we are going to see additional movements sort of emerging that take advantage of this intermingling to really sort of to cross the boundary between public and private and engage on both levels to try to redistribute power from the sort of rarefied spaces where it's exercised currently to those who are more at the bottom. Okay, I'll end there.
Great, thank you. And our third panelist is Professor Cary Coglianese from University of Pennsylvania, from the law school, the political science department, and the Penn program on regulation, which pretty much covers the covers the waterfront in terms of what we want to discuss here. He also has a paper in the pipeline for in connection with this workshop.
Thanks so much, Ed. I do have some slides that I'd like to share, so I guess I do have the authority to do that. Great. Let me, as I'm sharing them, thank Mason for initiating and helping organize this, and many, many thanks to all the students at Duke Law School and on the Duke Law Journal for organizing this event and for doing such a fantastic job with the editing process for the print symposium. I should also add at the outset that my contribution is a joint one with Alicia Lay, who is a former student at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, now clerking at Federal Circuit Court. And everything that you like about the paper and the presentation, really you should attribute to her, and I'll take all the criticism and complaints my way. But I think the fundamental question that my paper addresses and with Alicia is the question really of the day for a lot of government agencies, and that is, when should you use digital algorithms to substitute for processes that are dependent on human beings? Should we, to build on Ryan's example of going to the registry of motor vehicles, should we still have human clerks, or should we automate that process so that you can renew, as at least I do in Pennsylvania, my car registration online, for example. But today, these digital algorithms obviously can go well beyond just the inputs into websites, but the use of machine learning algorithms to complement or even substitute for human decision making. And I think the general answer to this question that I at least see drawing from the literature is a big almost never. It's the concern is to quote Elon Musk, that artificial intelligence may be summoning the demon, and we have a lot of criticism of the tools that rely on artificial intelligence. And what I want to offer today is that the choice isn't between the current situation and some perfect algorithm that might replace it, but really between the digital algorithms and the current situation where we have. So when to use digital algorithms? I think the answer is a comparative one. When they work better than what really are human algorithms. And I think that it's really quite more than just even a metaphor to think about human decision making as algorithmic. Neural networks borrows its at least label from in a metaphorical way from human cognition, but humans, as any lawyer knows, follow algorithms. Administrative procedure is algorithmic. Voting is algorithmic. The design and structure of governments are algorithmic. And we have, I think, a situation where we should just be quite honest that humans haven't been doing such a great job. Public trust in government is at some historic lows. No more than about 6% of the American public has a great deal of confidence in the federal government. According to the latest Gallup poll, about 60% say they really don't have any trust in government at all. So the challenge, I think, is to think about this as not as in a litigation sense as algorithm versus algorithm, but in a comparative sense of how well do digital algorithms compare with the human algorithms that are driving government today. And let me just, to summarize the paper, do so in about 4 steps. The first is to focus on the human limitations. And some of these were introduced at the outset in Cass's opening keynote presentation, but they go well beyond just the kind of cognitive biases that he focused on most, but things like limitations of human memory. We can hold, generally speaking, about 4 variables at a time and process those simultaneously. And yet we know that today there are very complex problems that demand more than the analysis of just 4 variables. Fatigue makes a difference and limits decision-making by humans. Aging, impulse control, unfortunately, a good bit of substance control, substance abuse, issues, for example, in the legal profession and certainly across society overall that can impair human judgment. And of course, various perceptual limitations as well that lead to cognitive limitations and biases that are well understood in the field of behavioral economics. A lot of focus on, what may be most salient and not necessarily what might be most systematically accurate. For example, people engaging in motivated reasoning, looking for the information that bolsters their initial impressions rather than, again, what would be analytically accurate. Tremendous concerns, legitimate concerns about implicit biases on the basis of race and gender and across human beings. And those are just the individual decision-making limitations. Once we then bring humans together, we know that there are a host of other limitations on human decision-making, from groupthink to garbage can decision-making, lowest common denominator effects, Arrow's impossibility theorem, which calls to mind the challenges of ranking preferences in a meaningful way. And all of these are indeed related to the concerns that we have about government today. Not only government failures, like we have seen with respect to managing and responding to the COVID pandemic, or perhaps miscalculating in Afghanistan on the timing and consequences of a US decision to pull out. But also at the individual level, it's already been mentioned that in the administrative adjudicatory process, a tremendous concern about backlogs, the capacity of the system to process, because humans have those limitations. It takes longer to get decisions. Some applicants for benefits are waiting at times years for a resolution from government. And there's concerns about consistency or noise, where we have studies that indicate adjudicators that are, upwards of 90% of the time granting benefits, and other adjudicators in the same office only granting those benefits 10% of the time. These are real limitations of humans, and we have to be honest about them. And we have to recognize that there's at least prima facie reason to think that automated systems can overcome many of these limitations, both in terms of the processing speed and in terms of the accuracy of decision making. And that leads to the second point I want to make, and that is that we do see evidence that digital algorithms can outperform human algorithms. A recent experiment conducted by border officials working at airports in Greece found that if they used a machine learning algorithm to try to spot passengers who might be asymptomatic with COVID, that they could actually spot those passengers at the airports 2 to 4 times more accurately than using the traditional human techniques. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency could be identifying 6 times as many water pollution violators as they do currently if they used machine learning algorithms. Just one of a number of other examples, machine learning could make arraignment decisions in domestic violence cases that could reduce the rate of rearrests, that is, reoffenses in this important space by 50%. These are all, I think, tremendous possibilities and reasons to be rational optimists about the application of machine learning tools and digital algorithms and automation to overcome some of the limitations that humans do exhibit. Now, having said that, I think we also have to be, as in the last panel, I think it was Fiona who said, to be techno-realists, that in designing these digital systems, it's humans who are designing them. And the same kind of limitations that can afflict human decision-making in other contexts can afflict humans when it comes to designing these tools and applying them in the governance process. So that leads to, I guess, the third point, which is when to use these digital tools. And I think we've got to be smart about that, and we have to be deliberate. And what I offer with Alicia in the paper are some factors, first of all, that government officials could look to as at least some guideposts for their decision-making about when to use these digital algorithms. And I think there needs to be 2 sets of factors that human public administrators take into account when deciding whether to use an AI tool and then implementing it. The first is just to recognize that there are going to be many instances where machine learning just won't be possible, even. It's not likely to be. So there's some preconditions, I think 3 preconditions that need to be in place to make machine learning even a prima facie alternative to human decision making. First, you have to have some kind of clarity about what it is that the task that the machine learning tool will engage in, and even some degree of precision in being able to determine what that is. If indeed you can't define even the goal very clearly, then it doesn't seem that you should be thinking about using digital algorithms because of the mathematical and precise nature of these algorithms and the need to specify an objective function in mathematical terms. There's a related set of lessons that I think can be drawn about the need for goal clarity and precision from the history of using performance-based regulation. And we see time and again that performance-based regulation has tended to fail or lead to some perverse outcomes when the performance is not specified very clearly or precisely. But secondly, we need to have available data. And yes, there's lots of reasons to be optimistic and to think that governments have a lot of data available, but we also have to recognize that governments are, as Ryan rightly pointed out, behind the curve. A few years ago, the GAO issued a study that said that about 75% of the federal government spending on IT goes to supporting and maintaining legacy systems. So there's a need not only for data availability, but data processing capacity as well. But even when it comes to the data themselves, we still have agencies that have paper systems. And there's also challenges about linking disparate data and the need for good identifiers that can link disparate sources of data to the same regulated entity or the same individual. And lastly, we need to think about whether this use will be such that there's some external validity to the data analysis, particularly in very dynamic settings where the world may be changing faster than the data are able to change. Then machine learning tools may not be all that useful there. Of course, humans may well themselves be limited in those domains too. One thinks about economic forecasting. Back in January or February of 2020, though on any kind of system would have been challenged there because of the rapid changes caused by the outbreak of the coronavirus. The second set of factors, though, really do speak to the comparative question of what's better. We have to think about then, not only are the preconditions met, but are the digital algorithms actually outperforming the humans with respect to the principal goal at issue, but then also take into account the impacts on those who are directly affected by the algorithm. And here's where concerns about bias come into play quite palpably. And also think, by the way, about broader social impacts too. It may be one thing to tolerate some potential risk that there might be error in an artificial intelligence system for sorting mail. It might be another altogether to think about error in granting commercial pilots licenses, for example, in terms of the impacts on the broader society. So we have to be smart and think about these factors and try to validate them. And then in deciding to go digital, regulators and administrators need to engage in careful planning and analysis. We do this before adopting significant regulations. We should be thinking about comparable ways of planning and engaging in serious analysis before undertaking significant forms of automation. Also need to think about getting public input. This is one way of trying to counteract some of the biases and cognitive limitations that may afflict government decision-making and groupthink that might occur within an agency. And lastly, especially because, as Hannah mentioned, a number of agencies are going to have to rely on private firms. You need to also think about what kind of protections are built into the public contracts, the protections for the agency later being able to get access to data and various features of an algorithm to be able to disclose it, perhaps in the context of litigation, or just even perhaps in the context of demonstrating to the public that the digital algorithm is indeed working better than the status quo. We offer a framework to help government agencies in thinking through how rigorous to engage in planning and public input and procurement protections. And we suggest that the greater the stakes, again, comparing, for example, sorting mail to granting pilots licenses, but then also thinking about the extent to which the digital algorithm is actually making the decision, or is it just providing an input? And the farther out you are in terms of the stakes and in terms of the actual degree to which the automation is making the decision, then those are going to be the instances where agencies really need to be, again, with a parallel to thinking about regulation, where we do much more to scrutinize the benefit cost analysis and regulatory impact assessments for significant regulations. These are the areas where agencies need to be thinking harder and trying to be smarter about automation. Let me just conclude by saying that at the end, it really is a question of compared to what, whether digital algorithms can do better than human ones. And I think if we take a look at the imperfections of our current status quo that relies on human algorithms, we need to be open to the possibility that if we can use machine learning responsibly to improve government performance and fairness and the delivery of public value, then we need to be open to it and be thoughtful and smart about when and how to use it. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks to all three of the panelists. I will, in a moment, I will pose a perhaps long-winded question to all three of the panelists, but let me also invite everyone who's listening to post questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. I see we have a couple of them and we will get to those, but please feel free to add or to upvote the questions that you see. The question I'd like to ask pulls on a thread that I think I heard in all three of your presentations. And that is the question, and that is the idea that an important question to ask is not only should government use technology, but also how. The questions of how to fit technology into the operation of government in a way that is effective. And here I'm going to draw on some interesting things I heard over and over from friends who had been very effective in the technology industry, who then moved into government for the best of reasons to try to make government do these things better. And it's been so interesting to hear the contrast that they draw between the relative effectiveness of at least many companies in the industry at achieving their goals versus the way that government has been more challenged in achieving its goals using technology. Part of that, of course, is that the goals of government are inherently more difficult to achieve than the goals of many companies. But also it's partly because people think differently about how technology is put into action, if you will. One of the distinctions that exists in the industry is between technology and product. Technology is doing more hardcore technical work to create a kind of toolbox from which products can be made. But product is the task of trying to take this toolbox and construct something more complete that will generate desirable outcomes when put in contact with humans. And in this product role, or this product, the activity of creating a product, there are really a couple of axioms that one of them is that you have to go and sit with people as they come into contact with the technology and listen and watch and understand how the technology really affects their experience and what are the aspects of it that are generating positive versus negative impacts, not in theory or in a laboratory or a model, but what people actually do and think and feel as they are experiencing this technology. That's number one. And then number two is based on that, you have to iterate. You can go back and you can say, well, what if we change it? Let's try changing this. Let's see what happens. Let's go back to the people or go to other people and see what this does. And I think these are both activities that government has trouble doing. Both the activity of going out and sitting with people and actually understanding what experiences you're creating by putting this technology into practice, and also the process of iterating to try to learn from that experience in order to do better in the future. Government tends to have a one and done approach to applying technology to something. We will have a procurement, we will get a product, put it into effect, and then we'll get what we get. So to bring this all around to a question, my question really is how can we think about how to make government more effective at learning from these experiences and making technology that operates in a more humanely realistic way? How can we think about allowing government to do that, and how might we think about the processes of the administrative state that might help that to occur?
I'm happy to start
Please.
things off, Ed. It's a great question, and I think it actually bears on the point that that Sophia's paper was making in the first panel about empathy. And I have written in another piece as well about how moving to an automated state needs to, we have an opportunity actually to become more empathic. I think that the two challenges that you mentioned are not just challenges with respect to technology. Why do we have the kind of experiences that some of us might have when we go to the registry of motor vehicles? Maybe it's because even with the human processes, some state agencies haven't done enough to think empathically about, well, what is the kind of experience that the typical citizen resident is having when they engage with the government. There was and still is a huge amount of work in the field of public administration that tries to focus on, customer satisfaction and to some extent one has to wonder about whether we are really customers of government. But boy, I'd go for that customer satisfaction model if it at least is a way of getting government agencies to start thinking in the way that you've called attention to, even with respect to their human processes. But I think going forward, what we have is a potential, I think, and a need really, if we're going to substitute the status quo, to try to do better. And I think it's more imperative to try to figure these things out now. Part of that is iterating, as you say. I mean, we have to not only think ahead of time that what we're going to get is an improvement, but then we have to really try to verify and validate that we are getting something better as well. And, we can try to, and there are certain kinds of proposals for formalizing look backs and the like, maybe even creating mandatory processes for ex post evaluation. You're right, we don't do so well with that. There is a government agency, the Administrative Conference of the United States, that issued a recommendation a few years ago called Learning from Regulatory Experience, that really calls upon agencies to try to do more of that kind of ex post review. And I think what I see ultimately, and that'll be the last word, I think there's a great deal of potential for transformation of government in that direction that might be actually facilitated by the use of automated tools. If we can free up government workers from a lot of drudgery and reallocate them, and this would be the challenge, reallocate them into roles that are empathy ambassadors, if you will, to the public, and B, technical verifiers and validators and overseers of automated systems. That seems to me holds a great deal of potential promise for improving government overall.
Would either of the other panelists like to weigh in on this?
I'm happy to. I think your question made me think about something I read about a long time ago, which is when FBI changed its case management software. It took them like 15 years to switch over to a new case management system. And then once they had, the search function didn't work very well. So everything else about the system was pretty good, except for the search, which didn't work at all. And by 2012, when this transition was complete, I think rightly FBI workers had come to expect that if you had a case management software and you searched for something, the right thing would pop up, but that was not the case. And it, to me, is a striking example of how long this process can take within government agencies and how much the sort of long time frame can impede that sort of iteration. But it's also an example of the kinds of pressures that might push agencies to contract out certain functions where they can expect that the product they receive is going to work, right? The search for Palantir works, right? You can make a lot of other complaints about Palantir, but it works really well, right? Which is what's pushing, I think, agencies to adopt it. And I think what that raises is really a question about who the customer might be, right? Like when we're thinking about stakeholders and iterating in response to stakeholder feedback, who should we be listening to, right? In the example I gave, I think it's the workers at FBI who use the system, but there's many examples of products whose use will affect lots of stakeholders who have no opportunity to be part of this sort of iterative transformational process. And I think that our mechanisms for inviting them in, those other stakeholders, differ wildly depending on the context. So if that's true, then it maybe should prompt us to think a little bit more about richer modes of engagement. I like the idea of empathy ambassadors, but I'm not so certain that like ICE's empathy ambassadors are going to be that effective in that role, or FBI's or CIA's or NSA, right? Any of these sort of other, this parallel administrative state that's sort of immune from participation. And that's where I'm primarily concerned that the rights implications are severe and the opportunities for participation, even input, are highly limited and constrained by design. And so who we think of as the customer, who we think of as the stakeholder, then defines everything.
Sure. And I think certainly it's the case that one of the frustrations people have in trying to apply these ideas in government is that the people who are sent out to learn are not the people who have discretion to change things, right? And one of the things that industry is able to do that government has a lot of trouble doing is saying that the people who go out and see what customer experiences are have influence over what actually then occurs. This is very difficult for government. Pushing discretion out into the leaves of the tree rather than at the root is very difficult for government often. And Ryan, you look like you may have.
Yeah, a couple quick things. I mean, the irony is, of course, that Lindblom is talking about the branch method, which is a method whereby you actually iterate once you see what happens on the ground, right? So it's like not like the mental model's not available to the regulator.
Sure.
I guess I would say that I just want to point out that all of this is deeply contingent, right? You can look at like the Co-Determination Act in the 70s in Sweden, where labor is really strong, and labor says, you know what? Labor gets to weigh in on consequential procurement decisions, even by a private firm, because technology affects the lived experience of workers, and so they need to have a seat at the table. And that wasn't strong enough, because even if you have a chance to sit down and talk procurement, what should we buy? What's available to buy is a function of what the government has invested in. So the Co-Determination Act was amended to give labor a seat at the R&D table, so that the government spending on what should be developed, right, became something that labor could speak to. We're capable of doing these things, right? We just have a political economy where it seems an anathema, right? That's all I wanted to point out.
Great. Okay, so we have now quite a few questions from the audience. Let's see. Let me pick one that speaks to all three of the panelists about innovation in public consultation. To what extent do administrative agencies need to use automated tools to better listen to publics. For example, not necessarily holding more town halls, but listening to ambient public sentiment and discussion, including silence or gaps in the ambient discussion.
I will just quickly say that in McGinnis's book, Accelerating Democracy, he literally thinks that we should use like those predictive markets, online predictive markets, to like help the government see around a corner. You know what I mean? Like crowdsource of wisdom. There's so many different configurations. One of my favorite works in tech law is that Habermas at Discourse.net, which was Michael Frumkin years and years ago, right? Talking about how, in theory, the affordances of platforms would be able to maybe bring us together and do it. You know, so the prospect is there. Where there's a will, there's a way. But I just don't. I think that people would be deeply skeptical of sentiment analysis. Like I can just sort of see Hannah's like eyebrow arching about that. But there's other ways you could do. There's other ways you could engage stakeholders with technology.
Yeah, perhaps she is familiar with the actual lived experience of social media.
Well, I mean, yes, I think it's a nice idea. There is a place where this is already happening. Local police departments use this kind of tool to monitor public sentiment around demonstrations all the time, right? To predict whether there's going to be public unrest. I think that's a terrible example of the application, but it's also telling that this is how it's being applied by government in practice, right? To, instead of sort of inform policy, that there's this illustration of a pretty privacy invasive, sort of rights intrusive way of doing this that I'm not thrilled about. It may not be the only scenario in which this technology is being used. There are probably a lot of better scenarios in which it's being used, but that's what it made me think of.
Well, I mean, to some extent, you know, paying attention to public sentiment is what democracy has always been about and should be about. And I don't know whether it's been based upon some systemic analysis of trends in social media or what, but I mean, just look at what's happened over the last week or two by many, you know, number of state governors who are, you know, declaring that even though we're still seeing 2,500 people dying a day from COVID, that they're going to be lifting the mask mandates. Why? Public is ready. That's what they want to do. So, I mean, to some extent, that is, I think, something that, you know, gets to the core of democracy, and you know, whether it's good or bad, at least, you know, is going to depend on your conception of democracy and its value. As to, you know, other automated tools, I would just, you know, point the questioner to some of Beth Novak's work, which I think is really important work about the ways that technology can be deployed, not so much for surveillance, but for public deliberation and input. And I think those uses certainly should be part of the conversation here as well.
Great. Okay, let me see. Let me turn to the question about, which was directed to Cary, but I think be interesting to hear what everyone thinks. Would an act that tackles the environmental impact of automated administration or policymaking, that is something like the Paperwork Reduction Act, but focused on energy consumption or environmental impact, would that provide a decent foundation for assessing the comparative necessity of automated systems?
I mean, to the extent that using an AI system, as I take it, the questioner concerned about energy consumption, probably more of an issue, I would think, with blockchain, but certainly can be a concern for anything that's demanding a high amount of data processing. Wouldn't be the Paperwork Reduction Act, but it'd be at the federal level, the National Environmental Policy Act, which already obligates the government to engage in an environmental impact assessment anytime it's making a major decision with potential for a significant effect on the environment. I don't know that that there has been any EISs yet related to computing. Maybe it's because we haven't been as aware about the energy consumption needs, or haven't thought about that in the climate context as being something that would require a NEPA type analysis. But I do think that just more generically, the question calls to mind a broader way of thinking about requirements on administrative agencies. That NEPA is just one example of a type of administrative procedure that I've called a management-based requirement, that before a government can undertake a certain kind of action, it has to go through a very systematic planning and analysis process. And that is what NEPA requires with respect to things that have an environmental impact. It's also what Executive Order 12866 requires for economically significant regulations, and going through the review at the White House through the Office of Management and Budget. You could imagine a statute coming into play, I think might be quite appropriate, that would require for certain kinds of decisions about automation that there needs to be a management process where there's some kind of documentation and considering those factors that I articulated about the preconditions for use, and the demonstration that it's working better, it's not having side effects, and it's been validated and tested, and there's procedures in place also to keep monitoring and assessing it even as it's being used and improving it. That would be a way of building in that kind of iterative process that Ed was talking about.
Anyone else?
Well, I mean, obviously, I've argued in my paper that that's exactly the place where we ought to bring modeling to bear first, right? Is on these kinds of processes, because they're really, again, I found it startling how lightweight in practice some of these analyses really are, you know. And I think that's a place where we could bring this to bear. I will also say that there's a great paper about what forces hide the material and energy costs of artificial intelligence, for example, but technology generally, by my colleague Batya Friedman, I think writing with Alan Borning. And in Kate Crawford's book, she talks quite a lot about the extractive and environmental impacts of artificial intelligence. And you know, it's interesting. And Cary's point is well taken. Blockchain even more so, right? This stuff is not, you know, not the cloud.
No free lunch.
It's no free lunch, exactly.
There have also been calls for things such as algorithmic impact statements, sort of inspired by the environmental impact statement construct. Thoughts on that kind of approach?
Doesn't maybe Andrew Selps has a paper about that? Am I making that up? Right, Hannah? Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea of an algorithmic impact assessment is appealing. Where we're seeing them sort of developed, there's an elasticity to the term. So I would say it's still sort of to be determined what that means, what the content of it should look like, but also who implements it, who defines the key terms. And so it's sort of frustrating from the perspective of, you know, the urgency of the problem, right? The urgency of being able to determine where we ought to use these mechanisms, and yet the inability to sort of reach a quick consensus on how we should answer that question. So I think, you know, impact assessments have a lot of promise, but one of the sort of threshold issues is standardization.
Excellent.
And I think Andrew would agree with that. I don't want to speak for him. I don't think that he's here. So
I think that if by standardization you mean, can we be assured that, you know, government agencies will fairly consistently treat the impact statement as a serious process and look carefully, that is a real challenge. In terms of this, if the standardization though is that you know, we've got to actually define with precision what algorithms need to do, I think that we won't get. In fact, one of the reasons why to go to an impact assessment or management-based set of procedures is because it is fairly adaptable. And we see this being used in a wide variety of government regulation of the private sector. For example, we're all protected in the safety of the food products that we consume by a set of management-based or impact assessment kind of requirements called HACCP that require food processors to go in some sense, regulate themselves. And one of the reasons we do that is because there's so much heterogeneity across different kinds of food manufacturing processes. The FDA, for example, has said that regulating fruit juices, just take fruit juices, that there's no two fruit juice manufacturers in the United States that have similar operations. And I think if you think about AI in government, or AI, quite frankly, in a lot of settings, what it is so highly variable. I think this is one of the challenges that the EU is going to face with their proposed approach to regulating AI. Is, you know, what counts as AI and the uses to which it is deployed can be so highly varied. So I think we can think about some structured ways like a hazard analysis impact statement kind of process that should be in place, but it should actually be valuable precisely because there's no clear, you know, one right way about going about doing this in every instance.
Thanks. So let me point out for everyone three things that are in the chat that are noteworthy. One is Ryan referred early, I think it was Ryan, to Michael Frumkin's paper, the Habermas paper, and Michael posted a link to that. Thank you. Jenna Burrell posted a link to an in-depth look at what algorithmic impact assessment might look like from data in society. And then Hannah posted a link to Andrew Selbst's paper that was referenced about algorithmic impact assessment. So those are all good things to check out. All right.
Can I add on that score?
Please.
Can I just mention there's a white paper that's been issued, I think, by 5 developed countries. I think the UK, Denmark, a number of other European countries that are trying to work on, and this goes to Hannah's point about standardization, trying to think about algorithmic impact assessment. I think a quick Google check, people could find that as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a minute or two remaining in our scheduled time. Let me ask the panelists if you have any final thoughts.
Well, somebody in the chat just mentioned that Hannah and I were not hadn't really been in dialogue, you know, and we are separately, of course, in Discourse in the Academy. But look, I would just say that I would like to associate myself with a lot of the things that Hannah said. I am deeply skeptical of a lot of the kinds of implementations we're seeing. I wish we could just use algorithms to reduce noise, as Sunstein put it earlier. But in actual practice, time and again, the output has been quite disappointing. We're losing money. People's rights are getting trammeled. People of color and other marginalized populations are bearing the brunt of it. We have to confront that stark reality, right? And so those of us in the academy, we can imagine all kinds of interesting use cases, right? But what's happening on the ground is deeply important. You know, that said, you know, we owe so much to so many. and we're not delivering on any of it. All right, and what's the role of technology in that? We also need to think seriously about that.
Excellent. Anyone else? Yes.
I don't know if Hannah, did you want to respond at all to Ryan?
I think I agree completely with what Ryan said. I wish that instead of these systems sort of being used in ways that appear so illegitimate and so much to undermine our central sort of my intuitions about what I would like government and policymakers to be capable of. I wish they were being used for everything good, right? And yet they're infrequently, those cases where they are being used for good are so infrequently top of mind for critics. And I think we need to reckon with why that is. If we want to sort of rehabilitate the reputation, I think we need to really take it seriously. So I want more modeling, right? I want more modeling for good. I'm very suspicious of what it in practice will be used for.
Excellent. I think that's an excellent point on which to conclude our panel. Let me thank all three panelists. Again, thank the organizers, thank Mason Marks as well. And I hope we can continue this conversation and engagement.